Cleanup for 2D animation is more than just making finished looking lines and closing the gap for coloring. It's a whole new skill and world of its own, and there's a reason why there's so many people who have worked primarily as cleanup artists in studios. While normal 2D rough animation you can be loose and expressive and rough, cleanup is where things have to be a bit more articulate, a bit more specific, and it represents the final look of the production. So I'd like to share my own thoughts regarding cleanup for 2D animation. Hey guys, this is Toniko Pantoja, and today I'd like to talk about final lines and cleanup for 2D animation. It's actually one of the most demanded requests I've been getting recently, how to do cleanup, how to do final line for your rough animation. I'm the weirdest person to ask for that because if you know my work, I tend to favor loose noodly drawings and I really favor sketchy lines. Like, I'm the type of guy who prefers the 60s to 70s Xerox Disney look, so films like Robin Hood, Sword in the Stone, 101 Dalmatians. I prefer that look compared to the clean and Renaissance look that they had going to the 90s, so films like Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Hercules, and so on. So that's something you should know about me. But I'm just going to talk about generally how I clean up my animation regardless of style. And I want to share some tips that I was given by a Disney veteran who was a cleanup artist for Disney back in the day. The first thing you need to know is that every production has its own art direction that requires different approaches when it comes to cleanup. Animation is a vast world of different styles, genres, and art direction. Some use sketchy lines, some use clean lines. Some utilize line weights and pressure, and some just use a constant line weight with no change. Some use irregular line patterns with opacity changes, for example, and some use textured lines. Some don't use lines at all and use colored shapes with no clear lines separating those colors. When I was exploring the animation for an early version of Kipo, Red Seacrest was really specific about the lines being slightly scratchy but not sketchy or too chicken scratchy. He referenced James Baxter's tie downs for the line look of Kipo. It was oddly specific, and that's what made it hard to track when I was exploring how to do that in the animation cleanup. And mind you, I was also doing character turnarounds for that show. So that's just something that you need to know because cleanup, depending on the art direction of the show, it's its own world with a lot of different rules. However, a common cleanup line you'll see is just a standard line with constant thickness, nothing special going on, and most outsourced shows have this, and it's the most simple to keep track of. So if you're looking for something that's just simple and clean, with something that's not too fancy or too complex, something that is safe, I would just use a simple line with little to no change in line weight and thickness. Or just a hard round brush with pressure sensitivity on only the size and not on the opacity. If you want to do a good job with your final lines and cleanup, you have to have a good sense of design. So if you want to do a decent job at cleaning up, have a good sense of your principles of design. So it's not just making clear lines and closing those lines, closing those gaps. One of the reasons why cleanup is so tricky is because if it's not done properly, it can ruin the integrity of the rough animation, where the drawing feels good, it has a lot of raw energy, you can feel the form. If it's not done properly, your lines can feel static and lifeless. It can also flatten the drawing when the rough animation feels so solid. You can also make the error of having distracting line boils or even tangents. Another thing that you might want to consider is to look at your rough animation and break down why the drawing works right now before you clean it up. And a challenge is to get the good qualities of that rough animation and do it justice when you do clean it up. So this kind of leads to a few of my next points, which is you want to get a good grasp of your line confidence, your line weight, and having a good knowledge on what lines can do by themselves visually. So you want to have a good feel of drawing lines with confidence and having a good control in applying line weight and pressure. So being able to draw lines with a few or single strokes and not trying to draw a single line with many chicken scratches. So again, it's just being really confident when you draw your lines. Line weights can illustrate things like weight, depth, lighting, intensity, and many other things. And I also talk about how to indicate form by just using lines alone, without shading, without underdrawings. I actually made 2 videos talking about this stuff, so check them out in the link below. Go practice drawing your lines and observe the effects that lines have in other works of art. You might also want to consider adjusting the way you hold your pen depending on what you're drawing. So this is a tip that I got from a Disney veteran cleanup artist. His name is Alex Tapetti, and he was a guest for our animation class when I was still at school. So if you hold your pen further away from the tip, you're bound to make bigger, looser, and organic shapes that are great for things like fur, hair, or maybe even bigger forms. Instead of using my wrist, I used a range of my whole arm or just a forearm, whereas holding your pen closer to the tip can make for more smaller and precise parts like maybe eyelashes, accessories, and things like that. However, I don't try to stay here too long or my hand will die. When I make my strokes, I like to do it more in a pulling motion since I'm letting gravity do the work. Since pushing the pen away from me, that feels like it requires more energy than me pulling the pen closer to me. But this is just really a personal preference, and this is something that you just have to get familiar with over time, so you just become less rigid and shaky with your lines. I would also do your cleanup keys in the same order as you did your rough animations. So if you did your rough animation pose to pose and you figured out all the in-betweens already, I would just draw in the main keys and poses first. So things like keyframes and breakdowns, and then eventually make it to the in-betweens. Kind of like you're setting up milestones throughout your animation. If you did your rough animation straight ahead, so there's no clear key pose, I would make key poses within all of that rough animation, somewhere in the middle, somewhere in the end, somewhere in the beginning, and I would just work my way to breakdowns, to in-betweens, etc. Now, I know some people ask, should I draw my clean lines more sketchily or just single clear bold lines? And this usually depends on the project. Dream Bandits and City of Secrets utilized a sketchy art direction that required multiple strokes to really get that sketchy look. Whereas this other project that I'm working on, I want the line to be a bit more crisp and more clean. If you're someone that wants to do less strokes, I have a challenge for you. So sometimes I put a rule in my head where if the direction of my strokes changes for more than 45 degrees, I'll lift the pen up, I'll let go and create a new stroke. If it veers off 45 degrees again, then I'll release the pen and create a new stroke. And I mean, this is just an abstract number. You can set it to 90 degrees. You can even set it in a way where it's based on the type of line that you draw. So a line could be a straight line, you start a new line. It could be a C curve, you start a new line. It's an S curve. It's all really up to you. It's just that the reason why I set some of these rules or some of these strategies is to help me have control of my work, have something that I can go to, and have ways to be more decisive with my strokes. You set little internal games and strategies for yourself. Take advantage of the digital tools for drawing. Cleanup can be a huge pain in the ass because it requires you to be a bit more precise and articulate with your lines. With that in mind, my hand starts to hurt a little because I personally can't maintain all that steadiness. I find myself drawing a line, then I realize I don't like it, so I delete it, I draw it again, then I make a mistake, I delete it again, I draw it again. It just becomes too tiring. Softwares like TVPAINT have tools like line stabilizers, so my shaky lines suddenly become a bit more smooth. There's even tools like a Bezier 3-point line tool where I can just click where the line begins, where the line ends, and then I can establish how curved it is. This allows me to create more precise and controlled in-betweens for curved shapes. A vector program like ToonBoom Harmony has an ability where you can change the line thickness after it's been drawn. You can change the texture, the quality of the line, the style of the line, and sometimes these tools can lead to accidental breakthroughs. Now, there's another tip that I'd like to share, and I can't remember if it was Alex Tepetti that showed this or if it was somewhere that I learned online, if I was told this by someone else. But it was just a random tip that I heard, which was to draw within or inside of your rough animation art. So what I mean is, if your drawings are super rough, super sketchy, try and make your clean lines within or inside of the rough sketch. Now, my reasoning to this is that I'm also taking into consideration the negative space of the drawing more so than the rough lines. So this means shapes inside of the line art and shapes around the line art. If you notice my initial sketch, they're very rough, they're very loose. The brush might be a bit too thick, it might be a bit too messy. So I'm making lines around negative space of the shapes those lines are creating. So whether you're drawing beyond or within the rough sketch that's very messy, make sure you consider the negative space the rough sketch lines are forming, and then make your clean lines prioritize that. If you want to avoid things like line boil or things constantly changing throughout the animation, stay observant on your accents and changes. And one of the reasons why a lot of cleanup, by the way, I'm guilty of this, has a lot of line boils and the form is changing nonstop is because some accents are left out. So what do I mean by accents? They're like little points of interest within a drawing. So things like a little pointy part or an angle change or a straight line versus a sharp line. So this is why I always say don't always use the light table, because if you're not trained enough, you're not going to be able to see it. So keep flipping between your drawings, really observe how a sharp angle or point moves, And then while you're in-betweening, for example, put a point on that to remind yourself that there's going to be a sharp angle change here when you're doing those in-betweens. So here's an example. I'm drawing a nose right now for this character I'm making in-betweens during the cleanup, which has specific angles to describe the tip of the nose. If I were to rush the in-between cleanup, I could lose all the minute details of all the sharp angles within the nose. Therefore, it would create a boil, or the drawing would just constantly lose form. There are several ways to mitigate this. And again, constantly flip and put points as a reminder to tell you where the accents and sharp angles occur during the in-between. Another is to utilize shift and trace, for example. A technique where you get your previous drawing and your next drawing, you adjust it so it's in the same position as your current frame and just trace in between them. The shift and trace technique is a great method for, solid drawing and keeping things consistent throughout the animation. I made a video on how to use this technique. Link in the description below. Or you could work smart, select the previous drawing or key, copy and paste an element from that drawing. Now remember, this gets trickier and harder depending on how complex the art direction is that you're going for, or how complex your cleanup is. So if your cleanup has lines that have constantly changing line thickness, that's another factor that you're going to have to keep observing too. I want to talk about my usual go-to because, like I said, cleanup isn't my strongest priority. It isn't even my strongest forte when it comes to 2D animation. I prefer my lines a bit more inconsistent, a bit more loose, and a bit more sketchy. It gives it a bit more of a human touch. And this isn't me trying to cop out or make excuses for my cleanup work. It's also because when I work on animation projects, I'm involved in every single stage, from the rough animation to the final compositing. I have to finish projects at a certain quota and budget. However, what if I want to keep my lines a bit more polished, a bit more consistent, and something that will make my work a bit more easier when I do color these lines? And how do I retain some of the quality in some of my drawings where I am able to play around with the line weights, the line pressures, and the line complexity? So what I usually do is my keys and my breakdowns have more visual information in terms of line quality, line thickness, and more of the design sense. Whereas when I work on in-betweens, I use a standard brush with almost no pressure, or maybe pressure only the size, but really it's a very generic brush, and utilize more digital tools like Bezier lines or just straight line tools. And this saves a bit more time for me. And it's enough to make the in-betweens not too distracting and not to take up most of my time. And again, the more simple your line work is, the easier it is to color when it comes to gap closing or the paint bucket tool, etc. But I know my key drawings and my breakdowns have the most detail or the most specific nuances in the line work. But this is just one way of me working around my cleanup lines. Because the task of cleaning up your lines, it's its own world with a lot of different disciplines. It's going to be the final look of your animation. And once you have those lines figured out, then you can move on to coloring. And I made a video talking about how I color my animation work, or how I color my cleanup lines. Go check that out in the link below. Anyways, those are just some of my tips for cleanup. Okay, bye. Interested in learning hand-drawn animation or learning how to finish an animated shot from beginning to end? Have a look at the store where you'll find the complete Introduction to 2D Animation video course, tutorials, and other resources. Learn classical animation approaches, drawing, lectures, techniques, and other process videos. Visit the store through the link in the description below.